Thank you for tuning in to No Sudden Moves Radio. And remember, stay on the proven path so you don't risk falling behind. Here at Business Legends, we don't overthink it. Look around and see what everyone else is doing. If it's working for them, it will work for you.
Welcome to Wait It Out, where we believe there's no reason to act now. The opportunity will still be there when the timing is better.
The age of disruption isn't coming, it's here. And the boldest move isn't following the crowd, it's following your why. I'm Patrick Ledden, and you are listening to Disruption Lab. Hello and welcome to the Disruption Lab. My name is Patrick Ledden. I'm your host every week to have conversations about how people could take disruptions in their life, the small to the large, and everything in between, and turn them into something positive. Some of you might know me because I'm the author of the forthcoming book, Disrupt Everything. You may have listened to the Leadership Lab podcast in the past. There might be different ways that you kind of come across this, but regardless of how you showed up, we're glad you're here. And we want to share some thoughts with you because we know life is full of curveballs, but some people can turn them into home runs. I'm joined today by somebody who's just like that, Andrew Maraniss. Andrew, thanks very much for joining me. Andrew Maraniss is a New York Times bestselling author, and he writes books about predominantly athletes and how athletes have come from situations where they're faced with adversity and really written some positive, amazing stories for themselves. So Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's an honor to be with you.
Now, we've known each other for how many years now, Andrew?
Oh, gosh, probably close to a decade now, Patrick. And I know I was on your previous podcast, so I appreciate this chance to come back and speak to you again in a new context.
Dude, I'm excited for it. You're just such a great fit for both of them, but especially for this one, because you write about people who oftentimes are facing adversity, whether they're marginalized athletes or kind of like doing something as a first in sports, or somebody who politically kind of finds himself in a really challenging place and just kind of steps up. So if you don't mind, kind of paint that picture. Like, who do you write about? How do you choose who you write about?
Right. So I write nonfiction, sports, and social justice types of books is what I would say. Biographies, but also other narrative nonfiction. Four maiden books. First is Strong Inside, which is a biography of Perry Wallace, the first Black basketball player in the history of the Southeastern Conference. Games of Deception, which is on the first U.S. men's Olympic basketball team that played at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. Singled Out, a biography of Glenn Burke, who is the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. And Inaugural Ballers, which is a story of the first U.S. women's Olympic basketball team. I also have a new series called Beyond the Game, Athletes Change the World, for little kids in first, second, third, fourth grade who are reading chapter books on their own for the first time. And these are books about each is an illustrated biography on an athlete that has done something significant to help people outside of sports.
When you look at athletes, like, let's take Perry Wallace, for example, how did that story come up on your radar? I think I remember a little bit about you being a wannabe, or maybe not even a wannabe. You were actually a journalist pretty early on in your career, like single digit age. And
Right.
and then tell me about Perry. Like, how did you kind of stumble upon it? How did that story kind of grow with you?
Okay. Yeah. So going back to those single digits, for me, sports and reading and writing have always been connected. My grandfather sent me my first pack of baseball cards when I was 5 years old. And my parents say that I learned how to read by reading, those baseball cards. That same grandfather was in Wisconsin. We had moved to Washington, D.C., but he wanted to make sure that I was properly brainwashed as a Green Bay Packers fan. So he subscribed me to Packer Report newsletter and What's Brewing, which was a Milwaukee Brewers newsletter. I got Sports Illustrated in the mail every week. And so, sports and reading were always connected for me. When I was 13, I tried to start my own sports magazine. And I interviewed John Feinstein, who would later go on to become probably the best-selling sports author of all time. He was a young journalist, a friend of my father in Washington, D.C. at that time. So I had this little magazine when I was 13. And then when I was in high school, we had moved to Austin, Texas. I was a baseball player from my high school, but also the sports editor of our school paper. And I applied for the Grantland Rice Fred Russell Sports Writing Scholarship to Vanderbilt and was lucky to receive it. And so sports writing paid my way to college, a great school. And it was while I was a sophomore at Vanderbilt that I was taking a Black History course, and I learned about this man named Perry Wallace and wrote a paper about him for a college paper, and but that experience of talking to Perry, learning about the toll of pioneering, as a 19-year-old, I thought about the history that he was making, but didn't necessarily think about what it took out of him to be that change maker in that situation. But it was so educational, so inspiring to have a chance to talk to Perry. His story stayed in my mind for years. So it was 17 years later, I emailed him and I said, "Hey, do you remember me? I wrote a paper about you when I was 19. I'd like to write a biography about you." And I didn't necessarily need his permission. Anybody could write a book about whoever they want to, but I wanted to know he would cooperate for the story. And so that began an 8-year labor of love, 4 years of research, 4 years of writing to tell Perry's story to the world.
As I had a chance to read it when it first came out, it was it like 2015? I'm trying to think when the book came out. You may have mentioned it, but
yeah, it was late 2014, early 2015 when it came out. So it was 10 years ago now. And we just had a 10-year anniversary edition come out with a new prologue.
Oh, that's
and
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just remember when I read that, you mentioned like take a toll on them. And when Jim Patterson and I were researching for Disrupt Everything, we did find that there were people, and it kind of hit people in different ways. It's almost like everybody has a bar set at a different spot. So some people, it didn't take what many might perceive as like it didn't take a lot in order for somebody to feel like starting to feel the weight and pressure of some things. And then there's other people that I think vast majority of people look at it and go, how in the heck are you surviving through all of this? Right? How do you endure that? It's just that in some ways the bar throughout their life continued to get higher and higher as far as like what they could get over challenge wise. I mean, what did you see in Perry? Because he took a lot. He took a lot. I mean, I don't know if listeners know, but if you could kind of like describe some of the stuff he had to endure.
Sure. So Perry was born in 1948 in, segregated city in the South in Nashville. Just walking to school was a dangerous thing for him. He had to walk through white neighborhoods, kids throwing rocks at him, threatening to beat him up or to even to shoot him, So his whole life was surrounded by those dangers that came with being a young Black kid in this segregated city. He told me that in high school, so this would have been, he started high school a week after MLK's I Have a Dream speech. When Perry had been 12 years old is when the lunch counter sit-ins were taking place in downtown Nashville, 1960. While he's in high school, there's the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And so he told me that this whole period, in many ways, was exhilarating for him. And he felt like change was coming, positive change was coming through protests, through speeches, through legislation, and that there would be opportunities coming for him and for his classmates that hadn't been there for their older brothers, sisters, or for their parents. And so he had this sense of optimism. And however, he saw basketball as his way out, like his ticket out of town, out of the South, but was discouraged by what he saw at schools in the Big Ten or out West, where he would show up and they'd say, you don't really have to go to class. You're just here to play basketball. And he felt that he would be exploited in that way. And so that's why really he decides to stay in the South, in Vanderbilt, which had been a segregated school his whole life until he was 16 years old, and then finally things changed while he was in high school. And the coach was actually encouraged, and we could talk about this too. Basketball coach was encouraged by the chancellor to recruit a Black player to send a signal to the country that Vanderbilt was changing. But Perry suspected that this was going to be a really tough assignment as a pioneer. And you think about the places that this Vanderbilt basketball team is going to be traveling to Oxford, Mississippi, not that long after James Meredith has desegregated the school, and there are riots that accompanied that. Tuscaloosa, Alabama, not long after Governor Wallace was standing in the schoolhouse door. Perry told me that he would look at the schedule and look at the road games, and he would imagine what's the worst thing that might happen on one of these trips. And in his mind, it was that he would get shot and killed out on the basketball court. When he told me that, I was startled initially. And, to my knowledge, no one has been shot on a basketball court. And so I wondered, was this a realistic fear of his? But you think about the places he was going, the time he was doing it, the fact that people with much higher profiles, like John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, right? These are people that were assassinated in public at that time. And so it was a very realistic fear of Perry's. At a smaller level, he's being hit in the face on purpose by elbows in these games, and referees aren't calling fouls. So there was tremendous physical danger, courage that Perry had, but also what he told me, and this was interesting. He said there are three ways that we can all treat each other in life. You can be treated well by other people, you can be treated poorly by other people, or you cannot be treated at all. And I suspected, and I think a lot of people, when they think about Jackie Robinson or Perry Wallace or another pioneer, it's this idea of being treated poorly that you might imagine is the most difficult, like those scenes on the basketball court. But what Perry told me is that the hardest part of his experience was the idea of not being treated at all. And that was on his own campus in his own hometown, whereas one of the few black students on campus, he was sort of a superhero on the court, but just a nobody off the court, and ignored, felt isolated, not allowed to join the fraternities, not invited to parties, fellow white students that were in his classes, not sitting in that same row with him or even the row behind him. And this sense of isolation that lasted 4 long years as a college student.
As you were writing about Perry and then about other athletes going forward, did you find that there were a lot of similarities in the stories of like what Perry experienced and how he processed them, or was his unique? Or just, I'd love to hear kind of like, okay, you've studied different people who have gone into situations where they were not the welcome ones at the party and they had to, work their way through some tough challenges. Did you find that there's some similarities, for example, around like the toll it took on them or their ability to kind of find their own purpose in the process? I'd just love to hear, like, if you were to paint a brush across your work, what do you see?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I think one of the similarities was just a sort of a sense of faith that doing the right things, living by your own code of ethics will eventually pay off, sort of a sense of delayed gratification, and it might not be immediate, but someday, if you keep telling the truth, if you keep living by the principles that matter to you, that will be appreciated. And Perry said that toward the end of his life, that it took about 40 years, so you imagine it wasn't just the courage and the strength at the time that he was making this history, but to continue um, moving forward, even when you're not understood, you're not appreciated, you're not getting the love that you deserve, but that eventually that will come. So he always lived that way. The women of Inaugural Ballers, I feel, was the same. So these are the women on the first U.S. Olympic basketball team, which played in the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. They grew up at a time as young women in the 60s, primarily early 70s, where they were told basically there was something wrong with them for even being interested in sports. Oftentimes their schools didn't have PE classes for girls. They definitely didn't have varsity teams for girls. Their own mothers were against them playing sports. Nancy Lieberman, one of the stars of that team, her mom would puncture her basketballs with a screwdriver to try to keep Nancy from playing. Pat Summitt, one of the great leaders in women's sports history, especially here in Tennessee, grew up in a school district that didn't have a girls' high school basketball team. We would never know the name Pat Summitt if her family had not decided, well, then we'll move to another county that does have a girls' basketball team. Then she's able to play, in college and become a coach. Lucy Harris, the star black player on this team, growing up in rural Mississippi, where she was picked on for being tall and strong. You imagine a male athlete, like that's it. Those are attributes. But as a tall girl, that was she was denigrated for that in her school. And so these were women that refused to listen. They played the game because they loved it, not necessarily with any reward on their mind. Like, there weren't college scholarships then. There wasn't the WNBA. There wasn't even an Olympic basketball team as they were developing their skills. But they continued to do it anyway because they loved it. They found personal satisfaction in it. And really, the poignant part for me in writing the book was here, Olympians, medalists, silver medalists in an Olympics, players like Nancy Lieberman, Ann Myers, that have a profile still in the game, and yet they were they had a sense of gratitude to me that someone was interested in their story and wanted to tell it, you know, and I felt like if I had written a story about a men's Olympic basketball team, these guys have been interviewed to the point that they probably are sick of it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they kept the faith, you know, someone eventually will be interested in our story. And so that was an interesting experience for me. The one character that had a different, very different experience was Glenn Burke. So this is the story of the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. And, you know, as opposed to, and he was black, but it wasn't like the case of Perry Wallace, where of course you can see this as a black player on the court. People didn't necessarily know that Glenn was gay, you know, especially as he's coming up in the minor leagues. And he was concerned that if people found out his secret, that would be the end of it, you know, that he would be run out of the game. And it turned out he was right. That is exactly what happened in the future. But as he's coming up through the minor leagues, he was trying to think, well, how am I going to survive this experience? And he said, well, on one hand, maybe I need to be so excellent that if my secret is found out, they won't get rid of me because I'm the best player on the team, right? Mm. On the other hand, he said, maybe I just need to be mediocre and fly under the radar. And if no one's paying any attention to me, then I'll be safe. You know, and I think about, there were no other players probably in the minor leagues that thought their best route to the majors was being mediocre.
Yeah.
You know, that made me think about how, and no one was like in his face with prejudice at that point. You know, it was just a secret that he was trying to keep. And I wondered, like, how many other people are having to like self-limit themselves because of these attitudes that are just in the ether, you know, that would prevent them from succeeding if people knew something about them.
Yeah, I bet you there are a lot of people like that who have self-imposed constraints, and I'm sure I do in my own ways, but certainly in that type of situation, especially in something that's athletics is a meritocracy by definition, right? I mean, they're going to give the ball to the person who can throw it the fastest and most accurate, or have the, you know, be able to make it move the best way to kind of deceive the hitter. So you think, okay, this is an ultimate meritocracy. It won't play out that way, yet that's not necessarily true either.
Yeah, no, exactly. In all of these books, it should be a meritocracy, and we hope it is. We think it is. You hope it's progressing towards that. But in each of these cases, you realize that's not exactly the case. And that's one reason why I think sports is a good platform to talk about certain inequities in life, because you do expect it to be the meritocracy. Here you had Perry Wallace, who was a valedictorian at his high school, 3-time state champion in high school. And yet when it's discovered by the Vanderbilt fan base that he's being recruited to Vanderbilt, there are petitions sent to the coach that we're never coming to a game if you recruit this player. You know, all those years leading up to it, there had never been a black player in the SEC. So you see, it's not a meritocracy in that case. With Inaugural Ballers, these are phenomenal athletes that do not have a chance to pursue their love of the game because women are being told that they shouldn't be athletes, right? So gay player that Glenn Burke with the Dodgers, when Tommy Lasorda found out his secret, traded him to the Oakland A's. Billy Martin's the manager of the A's, says he's not going to let Glenn, quote unquote, contaminate his team. And so this guy who had started game 1 of the World Series for the Dodgers in 1977, who Dodger coach Junior Gilliam had said was the next Willie Mays, or had the potential to be the next Willie Mays, is run out of the game in less than 3 years. And so, you know, the meritocracy didn't play out there either.
In his case, did you actually sit down and talk to him?
No, so Glenn had passed away.
Oh, he had, okay.
Yeah, he died of AIDS in the 90s. And so that's a whole other aspect of the story. But I talked to many of his teammates. Dusty Baker was probably my favorite interview for that book.
Yeah, I'm a Cubs fan. Dusty was our manager for a while.
Yeah, Dusty's a great guy. And I was told he was a wonderful guy. And he turned out that was the case. With Strong Inside, I interviewed Perry many times over the 8 years that I was working on that book. And we became extremely close, especially after the book. While I was writing it, I was trying to keep a little bit of journalistic detachment. Games of Deception, you know, had taken place in 1936, so all those players had passed away. I talked to their family members and found one man named Al Miller who was fascinating. So he was 13 years old at the time of the 36 Olympics. He was in his 90s when I interviewed him, and he was a young Jewish kid in Berlin at the time of those Olympics, and he remembered going to the Olympic Village and seeing the athletes. He remembered seeing Jesse Owens run his race, win gold medals. But the next year in 37, his parents could see what was happening in their country and really wanted to save their son's life. And so they were able to get him out of the country. And he talked about seeing the Statue of Liberty when his ship pulled into New York. And I asked him, what was the lesson of that moment in history? How do we prevent it from ever happening again? And he said that he speaks to kids all the time, and he tells them, thing they need to remember are the last 5 words of the Pledge of Allegiance. And he said, as corny as it sounds, it's liberty and justice for all. And that the for all part is when that becomes in question, you know, your society's headed for trouble. And so that's the message I leave people with in that book.
Yeah, let's talk about when you go out and talk to audiences. I'm curious to see. I mean, when Patterson and I were writing this book, obviously it's full of stories, each designed to kind of teach a point along the continuum about disruption. But we oftentimes, would talk about how the audience would receive this or what would stick in their minds. You've gone out, I've seen you speak to audiences, I've seen you do book talks, and I'm just curious, like, what has resonated? What have people taken from it or been inspired by telling some of these stories?
Yeah, the fun part for me is writing books for all ages. Like, there have been days where I've spoken to a kindergarten class in the morning and senior citizens at night. It really literally runs the gamut. When I'm speaking to kids, I feel like they have such an innate sense of what is fair, and what is right or what is wrong. And so if I'm telling a story about Perry Wallace being everything that he went through sounds so unjust to a kid, they can't believe it, right? And what I challenge them with at the end is they have a choice every day whether to be a bystander or to step up, right? And that there were so many of Perry Wallace's teammates or classmates that could also see or should have been able to see at the time that their classmate or their teammate was not being treated fairly, and yet they chose to say, well, that's his problem, I'm not going to get involved. And so every day at school, there might be a new kid who has nobody to sit with at the lunch table, right? Or student that is not the most popular, right? But these kids have a chance not to live with the regret that many of Perry's classmates and teammates had. And so they can choose to get involved on behalf of another person, have empathy, step in someone else's shoes. That comes up a lot. And really, that's the same message with all the books, really, is this using your voice, stepping outside of yourself, doing something to help other people, right? All the books have that message to them. And I think it's important, whether you're a kid or you're an adult, that you find your way to make a difference. For me, it's by writing a book. For other people, it might be running for office or supporting a certain nonprofit, or so many ways that people can try to help other people or make a difference in the world. And I try to use sports, which I think is a accessible hook for all ages of people. It doesn't sound intimidating to pick up a book with a basketball player on the cover, or a baseball player on the cover, but hopefully you get something more in the bargain.
There is the reality that in every one of these stories, there is somebody who stepped up. Most likely, I would imagine. There's somebody who said, we'll bring this player here. Like you mentioned earlier, the chancellor at Vanderbilt saying, let's openly or actively go out and try to recruit a Black player. I mean, there's people who are doing those type of things as well. Did those examples tend to resonate or inspire people when they say, okay, when I'm faced with this disruptive moment where I hear something said or I see something that just doesn't feel right, it violates my expectations of what fairness is or the values that we as an institution believe in. I mean, do you find that their stories help propel that individual along perhaps, but also help all of us go, okay, if they can do it, I can do it?
Yeah, yes. So the most poignant example for me was there's a group of young people with intellectual disabilities in Cleveland, Ohio, that participate in a program called Youth Ability. And they read Strong Inside, the Young Readers edition of the book, together. And these are people that unfortunately are being treated as different, right? Or picked on in many cases. And they decided to come to Nashville. They took a bus to Nashville from Cleveland to walk in Perry's footsteps, and to see the school, Pearl High School, where he had gone to high school, to come to Vanderbilt, to meet with me, to learn a little bit more about Perry's story. They made little bracelets that said, "What would Perry Wallace do?" And they said that when they face tough circumstances, they try to remain strong inside, which is the title of the book. And so I was really incredibly touched by that. At an institutional level, I was proud as an alum of Vanderbilt that the school, which has required reading for incoming freshmen every year, used the book 2 years in a row and said, we want our incoming students to learn this history and ask questions of each other to make sure that all students now are not experiencing some of the same things that Perry did back in the 60s. How can we learn this history and not shy away from it, not hide from it, pretend it never happened, but to actually learn from it? So that was a substantive moment that had happened. And then there's a dorm named after Perry and a street named after Perry now through the heart of campus also. So in substantive and also symbolic ways, the sacrifices that he made are in some ways built into the culture of the school. And I think that's really important.
I'm just, as you were talking about that, I thought, wow, the kids who came down, or the adults, young adults who came down from Cleveland and visited the school and kind of met with you, the students you talked to, the young kids, the older folks that you talked to, the naming of the street, the naming of the dorm, all of those type of things. I mean, you've disrupted a lot by telling these stories. And I'm just curious, how is this whole experience kind of impacted you?
Yeah. Well, that experience of working on Strong Inside, getting to know Perry Wallace, it did change my life. I had never really intended to write another book. I wanted to write the story about Perry, and I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a publisher as I was working on it. Like a lot of first-time authors, it's kind of a catch-22. How do you get that stuff if you've never done a book
Yeah.
before? Like, how does this work? And finally, Vanderbilt University Press published the book. Um, and then 2 years later, I was encouraged to create a young readers edition. And that's really what changed things for me, was having a chance to go into schools and see the way that kids were inspired to read or to learn certain lessons on using their voice or empathy. That felt good to me. And so I wanted to continue to do that. And I felt like this is an area that I could continue to explore, is how do you use sports to tell these types of stories about people that have done something that no one else has done before, people that were looked down upon for some way, teach history through sports. And so that's what I've continued to do with the rest of my books, are really considered young adult books, games of deception, using basketball to talk about anti-Semitism and the rise of fascism in 1930s Germany, singled out using baseball to talk about homophobia, Inaugural Ballers using basketball to talk about the women's rights movement of the 1970s, or how Title IX, like what it really mattered about that. And these are certain subjects that middle school or a high school kid might not ordinarily pick up a book about some of these subjects, but the sports angle might get them hooked. Now I'm trying to do the same thing with the Beyond the Game series for young elementary school students. So those 4 bios in that series right now, one is on LeBron James, not just being a great basketball player, but starting a school in Akron for kids that were growing up in the same circumstances that he did.
Hmm.
Maya Moore, a WNBA star who quit at the height of her career to help free an innocent man from prison. Pat Tillman, who quit the NFL to enlist in the Army after 9/11 and was tragically killed in Afghanistan. And then the next book that comes out in a couple of weeks is on Jordan Marie Brings Three White Horses Whetstone, who's a Native American woman that uses her platform as an athlete to raise awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And these are books for little kids on serious subjects. But yeah, it's been a change in my family's life, that I went from a career working for a public relations firm to now really trying to lead with being an author, but also working in the Vanderbilt athletic department and being at a university that is supportive of writing books on the side, which more of a corporate job really wasn't. So um, it's given me a sense of purpose to have a chance to write these books and to get out there and talk about them.
Well, I really appreciate you spending some time today to talk to us about them, because I think I know for myself, I can speak for myself, and certainly for the listeners to some extent. I think, hearing these stories of people who have dealt with adversity, dealt with challenges, dealt with disruption, as we would talk about, and chose in those moments to, maybe sometimes endure the difficulties of them, persevere through them, take the longer look at something. One thing we talk about in our work on disruption is the idea that you can cast a vision of where you want to go to and see that light on the hill, but you also need to look at the brutal reality of where you stand right now. And in doing so, you recognize the gap between the two. And sometimes that these folks had to deal with both sides of that coin, right? They had to say, here's what I want, and here's what's going to happen for 40 years from now. But then there's also the reality of and here's what I face in this moment. I could be shot on the basketball court.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating for me to think about these stories through the lens that you bring to this, Patrick, and I didn't necessarily have in mind as I was writing these books the concept of disruption as it's talked about right now. But really, you're right. In every single one of these cases, there was that immediate disruption, which was uncomfortable. But then there was also the long-term vision of change, and sometimes, just this hope that what they were doing would be worth it, and with no guarantee, which is exactly the same thing that you're an expert on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the idea of being able to say, okay, in this moment, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I know that nothing will happen if I'm not willing to at least run toward it and see what I can do in the moment. Well, Andrew, I appreciate you joining us today and sharing your insights. I always enjoy hearing the stories and the insights that you've gained, but also just kind of reflecting on them myself. I encourage people, if you're looking for something good to read, pick up one of Andrew's books. It might be one way to get your kids interested in reading as well. Pick up something about LeBron James or about Pat Tillman and kind of understand the choices they've made in their life. It's probably definitely a step better than reading the box score or someone's career history on the back of a baseball card. So,
Hope so.
Yeah, a little bit better than that, right? But I guess those are tops, but you're tops as well, my friend.
Oh man, a good wordplay, Patrick. Thank you. I admire what you do. I appreciate the chance to talk to you.
I appreciate it as well. Well, everybody, thanks so much for joining me. My name's Dr. Patrick Ledden. Go make it a great day. All right, that's all we got, my friend. Thank you.